Hi, I'm Jess Fields. Welcome to the show. Today I'm interviewing Rod Dreher. Dreher is a senior editor at the American Conservative magazine, a prominent blogger, and the author of two New York Times bestsellers, The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming in 2013 and 2017's The Benedict Option, which has been translated into 11 languages. Dreher has been a contributor and writer for publications such as The Wall Street Journal, The National Review, The New York Post, the BBC, NPR, and numerous other media outlets. He is a native of South Louisiana, where he lives with his wife and three children, and he lives in Baton Rouge, where Pastor Tony Spell, who we interviewed the other day, also lives. Dreher is an Orthodox Christian, and he usually writes about the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. Now, I mentioned Pastor Spell because we did interview Pastor Spell the other day, and he's refusing to comply with the state's coronavirus orders. Rod Dreher had some things to say about what Pastor Spell said in that interview. We also asked Rod about other things that he's been writing about and covering on his blog, as well as his upcoming book, Live Not by Lies. I hope you enjoy this interview with Rod Dreher. Okay, Rod Dreher joins me now. Rod, you are a Baton Rouge resident, in addition to being a best-selling author and a notable blogger. So you wrote an article about Pastor Spell and some of what's going on with his church continuing to hold services in the midst of all of this coronavirus lockdown. Talk a little bit about that, what you know about it, what you've heard about this in the recent days and weeks.
Well, Jess, thanks for having me on, by the way. This has been a real source of scandal for Christians here in Baton Rouge. And I say scandal in the technical theological sense. It has been a real stumbling block for Christians to see this fellow Christian causing such a ruckus in North Baton Rouge with these services he's doing. So many churches here in town, my own church, St. Matthew's Orthodox Church, and other churches, Protestant, Catholic, have shut down to obey the governor's completely legitimate order or ban on gathering together. But this guy, Tony Spell, has been so defiant and so publicly defiant, it's almost like he's trying to pick a fight to build himself up and to get national attention with these services he's having. And I think the governor and the sheriff have been trying to be easy on him because they don't want to make this guy a martyr. That's what this guy's wanting, to be a martyr. But when you look at what's happening in Louisiana, not only here in the capital, but especially in New Orleans, where coronavirus is running rampant, we're a poor state in the best of times, and these aren't the best of times. We're going to be struggling to pay the bills, the hospital bills for the treatment of all these people, as well as to pay unemployment and all kinds of costs that are going to come from this virus. So we all need to be pulling together right now as Christians to serve the common good by staying at home. None of us want to be at home. We all want to be in church with our fellow believers worshiping, especially here at Easter. But that's not what God has laid before us now. And here you have Spell up there making national news by making a jerk of himself and daring the state to shut him down. It has just been so depressing and infuriating because I'll tell you, and we can get into this later if you want, this is going to be the kind of thing that when the left in the future wants to restrict religious liberty, they're going to look to Pastor Spell and people like him and say, this is what religious liberty means, being able to come together and worship and be together and spread the virus in a time of pandemic. This is not what religious liberty means, but that's the sort of ammunition that Tony Spell has handed to the opponents of religious liberty.
So you mentioned a little bit about the health consequences of the virus. Obviously, we've been hearing a lot about that. I want to play a little bit of a clip of the interview we did with Pastor Spell the other day and get you to respond to this. Let's play this real quick.
Early on, but our government is so simple right now. They're telling everybody, wash your hands for 20 seconds. Have you tried to run your hands underwater for 20 seconds? It's impossible. You can't do that.
So have you had anybody in the congregation test positive for coronavirus at any point?
I've had many people test. However, none have tested positive as of yet. We expect people to test positive. We're a large congregation. But at the same coin, I know people that test and then they quarantine. The test doesn't come back for 10 days, and their quarantine was only 7 days. They came back positive on day 10. Their quarantine's already over, and they're ready to go back into public life.
So if you have people in the church that test positive, how are you going to address it? Are you going to let all the congregants know? Or are you going to kind of say, hey, we've had so many people test positive?
Yeah. No, what I say to that person is obey the medical professionals' recommendations, which is the quarantine. And I do live stream my services right now. We typically do not, because live streaming promotes church absenteeism. So
if you have folks that test positive, you're not going to tell the whole congregation. You'll deal with it with those individuals.
With those individuals, because I don't want them to be excluded like they're lepers when they do come back. And if you remember in the late 80s, there was the AIDS scare. We wouldn't touch doorknobs. We wouldn't go to public bathrooms. We were in fear and terror. Well, all that kind of faded away, and it can only be transmitted through blood, sexual contact, what have you. COVID is so young. COVID-19 is so young right now. We don't know what to believe. No two doctors can agree. I've got medical professionals in my congregation that don't agree. Oh, it's this, it's that. So it's so young right now, but this Bible has been around a long time.
All right, Rod Dreher. So if somebody in the congregation tests positive, and presumably that's possible because there's quite a lot of spread right now in Louisiana and in the Baton Rouge area, he's not going to tell the congregation. And he says actually his medical professionals know a lot better than anybody else. I mean, what do you your reaction to that?
This is nuts. This is genuinely nuts. If you go to that congregation and you've been exposed to the coronavirus, you have a right to know. He has a moral obligation to tell people in his congregation if they've been exposed. I don't even know where to start with this, Josh. It's so irresponsible. He's wrong to say that we don't know how this is transmitted. We certainly know how it's transmitted. This is transmitted by exposure. It's transmitted by coming in contact with the virus on surfaces. It is even transmitted by coming in aerosol contact with it, which is why they say don't come together in large groups, because that's how it gets out there. I don't know whether he's consciously lying to the people or whether he really is that simple and is saying that we don't know how this responds. But this is wrong what he's doing, and he's holding the Bible up as if it's a scientific textbook, when the Bible doesn't claim to be a guide for how to handle pandemics. There is no real conflict between Holy Scripture and what the government is asking us reasonably to do in this pandemic. When you think about in the early church, one of the things that gained Christians a great respect in pre-Christian Roman Empire was the fact that when the plagues came and most people ran away at that time, the Christians stayed behind to care for the sick and the dying. And people remembered that when the plagues were over with.
At this point in the interview, we faced some brief technical difficulties. Once I reconnected with Rod, we restarted the conversation. Just continue where you were before, I guess.
Well, I think I was talking about how the early church, Christians made a reputation for themselves in the Roman Empire when a plague came. The Romans, the pagans, ran away from the sick and the dying, but the Christians stayed to serve them, to care for them. And when the plague was over, the Christians were known as those who would not abandon the sick. They even took care of those outside their congregation. When this plague is over, I would hate it if Christians were known for what Tony Spell is doing. Someone who, because of his own arrogance, and almost in a way of testing God, has made Christians or given Christians a reputation of putting themselves over the common good. Because here's the thing about what Tony Spell is doing. If people want to go to his church and risk getting the disease, that's their business. But as we know, the virus doesn't care about our narratives. Everybody who goes to Tony Spell's church, if they're exposed to the virus, and as he told you, he expects some will be, when they go out of that church, they go back into their homes, they go back into their communities, maybe in their workplaces if some of them are still going to work now, and they spread it. This is how what Tony Spell is doing affects the entire common good. Now, let me tell you, all around Baton Rouge right now, there are scores and scores of Christian churches that are closed, like my own church, because this is what we have to do to defeat the virus. These churches don't make the national news. Tony Spell's church, even though he and there may be a handful like him, but he's the one that's made national news, they're the ones that people are going to remember or remember what Christians have done by. And I know that there are people out there who cannot stand Christians and who want to seize any possibility for oppressing religious liberty. And Tony Spell is handing them a gift wrapped up in a bright gold ribbon with his arrogance.
So, Rod, I mean, Tony said, Pastor Spell said that, you know, in the main, what he's trying to do is avoid people being treated as lepers, right? I mean, he's afraid of the stigma associated with the virus. I think that's probably one of the ways he would respond to you, is saying that he doesn't feel he needs to notify the congregation because he's afraid of the stigma there. I mean, what do you say to that?
Well, I think we have to be mindful, certainly, that people who suffer from the virus or who have suffered from the virus don't bear that stigma. But the way to do it in an infectious situation is not to keep people in the dark. That's what breeds stigma. That's the sort of thing that makes people afraid of each other. Tony Spell also said in his comments to you, Jess, that he's afraid that this, if we go to live streaming, it's going to get people in the mindset of not going to church. I think he's got half a point there, because I think what we're going to see, the longer this drags on, the more people get out of the habit of going to church on Sunday, the harder it's going to be for a lot of Christians to get back into the habit. But then again, those were nominal Christians in the first place. You know.
So I asked him about he believes, as I think you saw with this, he believes that this is a constitutional issue. He believes this is a First Amendment issue. I asked him about that because he mentioned building a defense team, and let's take a look at what he said.
And yes, we are having to defend going to church. I've had to hire the greatest constitutional lawyers in America to help me defend my right to do that.
So who is on your legal defense team? I mean, who?
Yes. Judge Roy Moore, Montgomery, Alabama, who is one of the greatest constitutional attorneys alive today. Civil rights attorney Joseph Long, who has filed suit and is going to federal court, where they're not elected judges but appointed for lifetime judges, who will rule in our favor. Attorney Jeff Wittenbrink, who is also a constitutional attorney. All of these people have been in our services and are saying this is gross government overreach, and they see the least restrictive means. This is an attack on the church, and they're not even filing it as the least restrictive means argument. They're filing this as we're endowed by our Creator with these unalienable rights, and our rights are the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Our pursuit of happiness is going to church.
So he's very confident. He mentioned later that they would prevail at the Supreme Court of the U.S. What do you think, Rod?
Well, I mean, look, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but if the best you can boast is Judge Roy Moore, the Alabama judge who got thrown off the Alabama Supreme Court because of his shenanigans, come on. I mean, look, what I do know is this: the U.S. Supreme Court has said in its First Amendment jurisprudence that the right to freedom of religion, the right to a free press, is not absolute. The First Amendment guarantees us a right to free speech, but it doesn't guarantee us the right to shout fire in a crowded theater. Similarly, we have pretty broad rights to worship, right, freedom of religion in this country. They're always contested, but the courts have been pretty good on that over the years. But we don't have an absolute right to do whatever we want to. And if there's ever a situation in which the right to freedom of assembly and freedom of worship was justifiably restricted, not negated, but restricted temporarily, it's during a pandemic. I think the Jacobson ruling from 1905 is going to be really important here. Just this week, we had a ruling from a three-judge panel of the U.S. Fifth Circuit here, based in New Orleans, Federal Court of Appeals, saying that the state of Texas had the right to restrict access to abortions or the performance of abortions during this pandemic. And they cited the Jacobson rulings, which says that under certain conditions, including conditions of protecting the public health in a pandemic, the state does have the right to take precedence, have their rulings take precedence over certain constitutional freedoms having to do with your body. I think that this would be an open and shut case in the case of Tony Spell.
So Rod, you certainly have been concerned about restrictions on religious liberty in America. I don't think anyone would accuse you otherwise. What you're suggesting, if I can summarize, you could tell me this is correct or incorrect. You're saying it sounds like that without having some reasonable restrictions on worship now, it will lead to far greater consequences down the line. Is that fair?
Oh, I think absolutely it will be. It will have greater consequences. Because think about the religious liberty case that most of us are familiar with, which was the Masterpiece Cake Shop case in Colorado, where a gay couple sued an evangelical baker for not making their same-sex wedding cake. In this case, there was not a matter of public health at issue there. The worst outcome that you could imagine was this gay couple didn't get the exact cake they wanted from the exact baker they wanted. This case here in Baton Rouge, with the church being open in a time of pandemic, that's about public health. That's about people catching and spreading a deadly virus that is overwhelming the healthcare systems in much of the world, and it's causing an enormous strain on government resources and on society. Just the day that you and I are talking, new unemployment statistics came out. 17 million people in the United States are now unemployed. We're not going to turn that number around until we start flattening the curve. What Tony Spell is doing, insisting on his rights without any comprehension or capacity to understand his duties to everybody else and to God, it's just remarkable. And I don't think it's going to stand up in court at all. And it's going to hurt us all in the future when religious liberty claims are brought before the court in the years to come.
Rod, there's one more thing I want you to comment on, if we can. I asked Pastor Spell about the personal toll that this has taken, and he gave an interesting answer.
Slowly but surely, Jess.
So, Pastor, you mentioned family, friends, and convictions. Do you have anyone in your family that is saying, hey, why don't you just listen to the governor's order? I mean, is there anyone close to you like that?
I have someone in my family, an uncle, who wants to change his last name. He says, I'm so ashamed of what you're doing. He says, I'm so appalled at how you're defying. The word is not defy anyway. There are no orders. There are no laws that we're breaking. The First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, Congress shall make no laws.
So how do you feel about that when somebody close in your family like that says, hey, I want to change my last name? I'm that,
It lets me know the failed public school system of America in the past 3 decades. It lets us to realize just how ignorant we are and oblivious we are as to our constitutional rights. It makes me say, our government should fear us, not us fear our government. However, people are literally losing their collective minds and are afraid of this virus, and they're afraid of their government when it should be vice versa.
So, Rod, it sounds like he is getting personal blowback.
I mean, look, I'm sorry to laugh, Jess, but This guy, he's blaming the public schools because people have the good sense, like his uncle, to realize that this guy's a crackpot cult leader who's going to get a lot of people killed, including the 675 children that they bus in every week, according to their website. These little children who don't have any choice but to be there. Their parents are sending them there. Come on, this is uh, he's making making a scandal for the church, a scandal for himself, and this is going to end very badly for him when those people start dropping dead in that church. And look, I live in South Louisiana. This is a conservative place. We're a conservative state. People go to church here. But I guarantee you that there are a lot of church-going conservatives like me who see that, and we just wring our hands and wonder, what is it going to take to shut this guy down? It's I'm a big fan of religious liberty. I believe that you have the right to be wrong. I'm fairly extreme on religious liberty, but it stops here. It stops here because I have my brother-in-law is a Baton Rouge firefighter. He has to go out on calls every day, and he serves the district that where nearby where Tony Spell's church is. Now, this is a guy who's putting it on the line, his life on the line every day to take care of people on these medical calls. Somebody like Tony Spell is making his life that much harder and putting his life in danger. It just infuriates me because if Tony Spell was going out there and risking his life to serve the poor, like bringing food to these people, and it would be one thing, but he's not doing it. He's doing it in a very self-aggrandizing way, in a way to make a martyr of himself. And he's got this guy, just from Baton Rouge, Woody Jenkins, former state representative, former U.S. Senate candidate, the head of the Trump campaign in Louisiana. Woody Jenkins is a real gadfly, conservative gadfly around here. Jenkins doesn't go to that church, but he is promoting and puffing Tony Spell to make him out to be a patriotic American citizen. It's just, when the national media figures out that Trump's Louisiana campaign manager is the secular guy, or Tony, I don't know if Woody Jenkins is secular, he's probably a Christian, but he's the guy outside the church who is helping Tony Spell become a national figure. It's going to look very bad on Trump.
So, as one South Louisiana resident, you're saying not everybody is on Pastor Spell's team with this, but I do have other local officials that we'll be talking to in coming days, some of whom believe that there is a real concern that some of these orders go a little bit too far. You've been covering this situation pretty extensively on your blog at the American Conservative, just the entire pandemic. Where do you feel these policies have a logical end, or what really should be, in your view, the final place that they rest? Is it too much to ask people, to stay at home completely, or to shut everything down, or should we go even farther than what we've done? What's your opinion on that, Rod?
Well, I think right now things seem to be in a pretty good place. It's been very hard on people. Clearly, the economy is collapsing in many places, and this is a horrible thing. But all you have to do is look at the body bags, the morgues in New York and Spain and Italy and all over, and to hear the testimonies of doctors and nurses who are on the front lines, to realize that there is something worse than losing your job. It's losing your life, or having your mother, your father, your grandparents lose their lives. I was listening just today to Governor John Bel Edwards on the radio. They were asking him, reporters, when do you think we're going to shut it down? And he said, I can't tell you that. We're getting good results now with the fact that we've been in lockdown for 2 or 3 weeks. We're starting to see the numbers come down, but Louisiana just had its biggest death day yet on Wednesday. But we're seeing fewer people admitted to the hospital. This is good. It shows that the policies are working. The thing that worries me, Jess, is what happens if we get to the fall and we've gone through this long shutdown and all the economic destruction, and the virus is still here. I've read, and a number of scientists say that we're not going to have, this thing's not going to be over until we have a vaccine. That could take a year and a half. And I just can't see our economy being completely shut down for that long. So we're going to have to figure out how much suffering and sickness are we willing to absorb. I will tell you this, though. It's not just Tony Spell who's acting this way. I live in a middle-class neighborhood subdivision in Baton Rouge. Rouge are doing the right thing. But you go out to the park and some people are out there with their kids acting like this is just summer vacation. These people are as bad as Tony Spell. They're not invoking the name of Christ in what they're doing, but they're also making it harder and harder and harder, exercising their own so-called rights at the expense of their duties. Funnily enough, we conservatives tend to have a very keen eye for noticing when liberals do that, demand their own rights over their duties to the common good. But when the shoe is on the other foot, as it is in the case of Tony Spell, somehow our vision gets awfully blurry. I think the left is going to hold this out to justly as a case of hypocrisy.
Well, let's pull out a little bit and kind of take a broader view. Your work has been very much focused on how Christians can live intentionally in community, regardless of what's going on out in the broader world. That's the subject of your most well-known book, The Benedict Option. And I know you have another book coming out soon. What's the title of that?
Title is called Live Not by Lies, a Manual for Christian Dissidents. I took the title from the last essay that the great Nobel laureate and anti-Soviet dissident Alexander Solzhenitsyn, before the Soviets expelled him in 1974, he wrote a last message to the Soviet people saying, live not by lies, calling on them to resist in practical ways communist domination.
Great. So in both of these books, obviously you're talking about how Christians can live in a changing America. With the pandemic, you have a major societal shift, as you say. It may be many more months, maybe even another year of this. And so how does what you've done in talking about the Benedict option, how does that play in this present situation? What should Christians be doing with these Zoom meetings and streamed services and so forth? How can you live the Benedict option in today's day and age?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because a lot of people who, when they've heard about the Benedict option, they think that I'm calling on Christians to head for the hills and, live in a bunker somewhere. That was never the case at all. But what I did say when that book came out, the general point of that book is that we are already in a post-Christian age. If you look at the statistics, the number of people, especially in the millennial and Generation Z generations, are leaving the church and leaving the faith entirely. So if Christians are going to hold on to the faith in this time, I said in the book, we're going to have to start living a lot more intentionally, lives of much greater communal intentionality and spiritual discipline in our own homes. I didn't foresee this pandemic coming, of course, but now that it's here and we find that we can't go out to our churches, those who have been living according to a life of greater spiritual discipline in the home with prayer and fasting and things like that, they're much better prepared to weather this with their faith intact. It's never too late to come over, and I hope people will read the book and see how effective it can be in helping them maintain a life of faith, even when everything else has been radically disrupted. So that's the message I hope from the Benedict option. Now, from this new book, Live Not by Lies, I started that about a year ago after I'd been hearing for the past few years from people living in the United States who had emigrated from the Soviet Union or the Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe. And they have been telling me that they see things happening in America now that remind them of what they left behind. In other words, the Sovietization, the rising totalitarianism in the United States. Now, that didn't make any sense to me, because this is America. That can't happen here. Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, one of the first things he says is that the great mistake people make is thinking this can't happen here. In fact, what happened in Russia could happen anywhere in the world. So what I did was go around for this book I'm working on and find out what they meant, what these emigres meant when they said that it's happening here in America. The kind of things they were talking about was that political correctness coming into the workplace, the ability to get people fired for saying the wrong thing, get them canceled, and so on and so forth. I ended up traveling throughout Russia and Eastern Europe, talking to dissidents, some of whom had been in prison for their Christian faith under communism, to find out not only what they see happening here in the West today, but what actions we can take, we Christians today, to prepare ourselves for what's coming. Now, part of that, Jess, was reading this book by famous book by Hannah Arendt, the political theorist, called The Origins of Totalitarianism. She wrote this book in 1951. And in it, she did a deep dive into the kind of world, the society that produced both communism in Russia and Nazism in Germany. And she talks about the different things that were present in those societies that made people susceptible to the Nazi message and the communist message. It's amazing the things that we have in common with pre-totalitarianism Germany: the loneliness of people, the atomization, the susceptibility of people to propaganda. Suddenly, as I began diving more deeply into it, I came to understand why these emigres to America from the communist world are so concerned. Now that we have the pandemic here, and one of the responses that we're going to see from governments is to do radically more surveillance of people so we can find out who's got the virus and where they're going. I think you can see where this is going, the potential for abuse.
So one of the topics that I know you've written about and has been covered in the last decade by a number of great books. One book about teenage girls called American Girls by Nancy Jo Sales comes to mind, about the atomization of society, with people spending all their time on their phones, and they're living their entire life on their smartphones. And now this is happening to adolescent boys and girls. Rod, how much do you think this present situation, with all of us having to do this on the computer, on video, how much does this contribute to the further diminishment of that societal fabric that you're talking about?
Oh, boy, it's amazing. The very much so, because we're getting used to being apart. Now, one of the things that I learned from interviewing the people from the communist world is that the communist totalitarian system, it depended on its power on keeping people apart, making people not trustworthy of their neighbors, because in those societies, your neighbor could turn you in for being suspected of being an anti-communist and so on. We're not dealing with that, but what we are dealing with is the forced fraying of the social fabric. I'm sitting here talking to you from my dining room. I can look out my window over the top of the laptop and see my neighbors. I can't walk across the street and see them. None of us can do that. But it doesn't mean that we hate each other, but it means that we are getting out of the habit of seeing each other. And the sort of things that were already becoming habitual in American life, the atomization coming through people spending more time on their smartphones and their laptops and such, has been exacerbated by this. And in this way, I'll have to admit that I have some sympathy with Tony Spell, that as people get out of the habit of going to church, they will start to think that maybe church isn't necessary. Well, maybe when people, sorry, we're dealing with the lights here to give you, is that better? Because the sun has gone down since we started.
This is just making it real, Rod. This is
Yeah.
reminding us that we're all on video now. So it's great.
No, I think that we do have to worry about this. And boy, what a painful pandemic. Because normally when people are sick, we want to draw closer to each other and help each other in times of stress. I remember here in Baton Rouge, when we had the terrible flood of 2016, that was an occasion for people in churches and schools and everything to come together to help those who had lost their homes and so forth. Now you can't do that. The way you help people is to go against your own instinct to get out there and put your hands on them and help them. The best thing you can do is to stay at home. And it does a number on your head.
So, Rod, my bishop, as I think yours also probably did over there, told me that, told all of us that you have to stay home. You can only have a very few people in church to celebrate Mass, liturgy, what have you. So in that sense, are those institutions somewhat breaking down, do you think? I mean, is it possible that entire churches, jurisdictions, archdioceses will be totally different in a year or two than they are in the past?
Oh boy, I think so. And this is one thing that worries me. I think a lot of people, Christians, are probably forgetting that our churches still need to pay the bills, and you forget to tithe if you're not going every week. I notice our priest has sent out a gentle reminder, as he calls it, reminding people to keep paying their tithe. We have just a really small mission church, so it's maybe a little easier there. But I've heard from friends who work for Catholic archdioceses who say that their archdioceses are having to lay off people en masse because they can't afford to pay them. Uh, I think too that this is going to cause a winnowing. I remember that, and I quoted this guy, the Benedict option, Pope Benedict XVI, Cardinal Ratzinger, one of my great heroes. He prophesied in 1969, I believe it was, that the church is going to go through a great purification. He didn't say it was going to be by the pandemic, but he said that people were going to fall away, and the only ones who are still left are those who are true believers, who are willing to suffer for the faith. Well, I think that's happening right now. We didn't think it was coming by pandemic, but I think the longer this goes on, the more, as I mentioned earlier, the more you're going to see the um, the nominal Christians just decide that they don't need church in their life. We don't want anybody to leave the church, but I think that this time of testing will show that those who were able to keep their faith, even when they couldn't come to church, even when it was hard, even when they had to sit at home and maybe only participate in the liturgy or the mass or services by Zoom and through family prayers, they'll be the ones whose faith has been proven more durable.
Rod, I want to ask you about an issue that is very tangential to this, but you covered it and very few people have. That is the Australian Cardinal George Pell
Right.
having his conviction overturned by Australia's High Court. His conviction was cheered by many who said that this was a major turning point towards, exposing the Vatican for a variety of different sex crimes and so forth. But you covered it early on as someone has covered this issue for 2 decades, and you said you were skeptical, and it turned out that maybe you were right.
Yeah. Yeah, the Pell case is really, really troubling. George Pell was a senior Australian Catholic official. He was tried and convicted for molesting two altar boys. Just the other day, as we talk, the Supreme Court of Australia, I believe it is, or the Senior Court of Appeals, overturned the conviction. The man should never have been convicted. I'm somebody, as your viewers may or may not know, I'm somebody who was a Roman Catholic who lost his faith by covering the scandal. It was the most painful thing I've ever gone through. I say lost my faith. I quit being a Catholic and became Eastern Orthodox. But it was a terrible experience. So I'm not someone who is eager to make excuses for Catholic bishops or abusing priests. But in this case, George Pell had been made a scapegoat in Australia for all the sins and failings of the Australian Catholic Church. You can hold them and you should hold them accountable for all the things they did wrong, but do not make this man, who could not possibly have committed the molestation for which he was convicted, he couldn't have done it. The Australian High Court recognized that. They recognized that George Pell, this elderly man, had been made a scapegoat by the anti-Catholics in Australia. And justice was done, but this poor man has had to spend over a year of his life in solitary confinement. As a true Christian, George Pell came out and said he does not want to seek vengeance on anybody. He just wants there to be healing.
Well, very interesting coverage of that. And Rod, we're coming close to the end of our time here. I really wanted to ask you kind of on that because of the Pell case, and you covered that. And there's a lot of other things going on in the world besides the coronavirus, but the only thing anyone's hearing about
Yeah.
is the coronavirus. And they're hearing people on different sides of the screen yelling at each other. What do you think has happened to the news environment as a result of all this? And what should people who maybe feel as you do or who want to get a more independent perspective, what should they be doing in this time?
Well, one thing I do, Jess, is I try to read widely. I'm at home all day now. We're all stuck at home. I read the New York Times, the Washington Post. I read conservative and liberal publications. I take a look at the Guardian in England, which is a left of center publication, but also the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph on the right. And I try to use my Chrome browser to read Italian and Spanish and German publications, because on Chrome it does an instant translation for you, just because I want to know what's being said. This is a time when there are a lot of ideologues who want to look to what's happening in the virus and our response to it as justification for what they want to believe anyway. I think it's incumbent on us, all of us, to try to be responsible in the things that we take in our news environment. But I think it's also true, and I'm criticizing myself here, it's important to turn the laptop off, to put the phone down and read read scripture, read novels, read something that is not the news. Because if you think about it, when I'm different novels I've been reading, they're a form of the news. They're something that tells us the truth about the world we live in that we're not seeing in the daily grind. Um, I, I've been reading books from Lives of the Saints and things like that that remind me what's really important. And I should say also, I've been reading recently for a blog I did. There's a book of interviews by this Romanian Orthodox priest, Father George Calciu. He died in 2006, I think it is. But he had been in the Gulag for many years, tortured for his faith, and had come to America. Ceausescu kicked him out. And man, it's something else to read these accounts of Father Calciu about what it was like to be in prison, tortured for your faith, and the kind of men he was there with, and to be reminded of this is what it means to bear the burdens for Christ. And if this man was put into prison with all these other Christians, Catholics and Lutherans too, like Richard Wurmbrand, and they maintained their faith even though their bodies were broken, their spirits were nearly broken by it. Why can't we do the same thing here? And all we're asked to do is to stay at home. You know, to me, this is a reminder. This is important news too, a reminder of how we are to bear our suffering. And I had to tell you, this book that I have coming out, it's really been meaningful to me in my own cloistering here at home, our forced cloistering, to go back and, because I'm revising the manuscript now, worked with my editor, to go back and hear these stories. One of the stories that's going to be in my new book, it's really relevant now, is the tale of Alexander Ogorodnikov. He is was a late Soviet dissident. He came from a very prominent communist family, but became a Christian in the 1970s because he was looking for something different. And when they finally threw him into the prison in the late 70s, they really made an example of him because he came from a communist family. They put him on death row, even though he had not been charged with a capital crime, but they just wanted him to suffer. So what did he do when he went in there? He was a young man. He witnessed over and over and over to these prisoners, some of the most hardened men in the Soviet Union. Well, the tortures for him got worse and worse and worse. And at one point, he was in solitary confinement and started to despair, began to pray, God, why are you doing this to me? I was faithful to you, and here I am being tortured and suffering. And he was granted a series of visions. Now, this man told me this himself. We were sitting in last November in a hotel lobby in Moscow, and he's an old man now, but very serious. He said, I began to see, not in dreams, but actually to see with my eyes, men walking with from behind, being led by guards with their hands cuffed behind their backs. And God let me understand that they were being taken to their execution. But I wasn't allowed to see their faces. He told me that after this happened several times, he came to understand that God was allowing him to see the men to whom he had witnessed who had become Christians because of his witness, and he was seeing them being led to their execution, but God was letting him know that they were saved and they were going to be with him in paradise. Ogorodnikov is telling me this story, and he began to cry. And he said that not everybody I witnessed to accepted Christ, but God let me see those who did accept Christ and then know that they were going to be okay. And in so doing, God let me, said Ogorodnikov, let me know why I had been given that kind of suffering. So I'm going to leave you with that. And when we think about people like Tony Spell, who is reacting to this crisis in, I think, a very foolish and embarrassing and selfish way, let's think about people like Alexander Ogorodnikov, whose name most of us may have never heard. I guarantee you, there are Alexander Ogorodnikovs from all churches right now in this crisis, in this pandemic crisis. They may be cleaning the floors at hospitals, maybe nurses, doctors, or just supermarket checkers who are making sure we all get paid, all get our food. They're the ones who are putting it on the line right now to serve the common good, and in so doing to serve Jesus Christ. I want to say, let's think of them and try to be like them and like Alexander Ogorodnikov, and less like this showboat preacher from North Baton Rouge.
What a story, and very much appreciate you sharing that, Rod, and thank you for coming on, and have a blessed Pascha and Holy Week coming up, and thank you very much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. God bless you, and God bless your listeners. I hope they have a fantastic Easter season.
And that was Rod Dreher, senior editor of the American Conservative, prominent blogger, and New York Times-bestselling author. If you have a suggestion for a guest on our program, or maybe you are a guest that could be on the program, email me at jessfieldshow@gmail.com. And remember, the podcast is available in video form on our Facebook page, Jess Fields, and on YouTube, Jess Fields Show, as well as on Spotify, Stitcher, soon on TuneIn and Apple Podcasts as an audio podcast. Thank you so much for joining us, and happy Easter.